Good. Thank you very much. And good morning. Before we start, may I ask a question? How many of you actually have somebody who's engaged in coaching them right now? Hands up. Ooh, not too many. Okay, and yet you're here to learn how to have better coaching conversations with your staff. Here's an interesting thing. Whether you know it or not, the people that you work with role model you. So consciously or unconsciously, they take their lead from you. So if you're getting behaviors in them that you don't like or are not delivering what needs to be delivered, the first person you need to look at is not them, but yourselves. Because part of my training is, I'm an engineer by background, but I spent 30 years in business development, but I'm also trained as a psychotherapist, as a clinical hypnotherapist, and as a master of an area known as NLP, which is a branch of cognitive psychology. So the first thing about leadership is that leadership starts with your behaviors. So if you yourself don't actually have a coach at the present time, then you yourself are probably not accomplishing everything you're capable of accomplishing in the role that you're in right now. Because one of the things that I see in organizations all the time is that the fundamental thing that's missing in a lot of situations are two fundamental elements. One is clarity, absolute clarity about what they have to do, and the second thing is a sense of control. So coaching gives you those things when you start working with individuals. So I just wanted to get a perspective on that in terms of when we get into this and if you're looking at doing this for your staff. Because remember, they'll be looking at you as a potential role model for where they're at. And if you're saying, I want to coach you, one of their very reasonable questions might be, well, who's coaching you? Who's taking you to the very best that you can be at what you do? Because here's the thing, it's impossible to do it on your own. No matter how good you are, and I'm sure you're all excellent at what you do, to be truly excellent at what you do, you need somebody external to yourself who's able to bring a different perspective and possibly additional skills that you don't yet have in order to be the best that you can be and to reap the rewards that go with that. So that's something perhaps to think about given the subject of the conversation that we're talking about today. Is that okay with everyone? Yep. Now, I'm in sales a long time and they have always told me that sales is a numbers game. Have you heard that? By the way, I do communications, not telepathy, so it's okay to sort of answer, that's all right. So, have you all heard that expression? Sales is a numbers game? Yeah? Well, it's not true. It's not. Sales comes down to two fundamental things. It comes down to the ability to be able to master a specific set of competencies. And competencies are what we call, advanced skill sets. That's the first thing. And the second thing it comes down to being successful in is the issue of focused activity. So it's not about numbers, it's about focused activity. So two things you need to be successful. I don't mean you, but the people that you're leading. They are a very clear set of what your competencies are and the means by which you measure their development in them. And the second thing, a very clear set of actions that they have to take in order to get to where they want to go, and a clear sense of the fact that they control those actions. And that's really what coaching is all about. It's about the ability to help people evolve themselves on a journey of perfection. Let me give you one of the things I do is I develop quite a number of models around this process. Let me give an example of what I mean. If you look at a situation where this is performance, you will get a situation if you ask anyone and they honestly answer, would you say you're accomplishing everything you know you're capable of accomplishing right now? The answer usually to that is no. Because the reality is most people know that no matter how well they're doing, they know they're capable of more. But they often don't know how they're going to get to that extra space. Athletes call it the zone. So at the moment, you have what we call a beta level and you have an alpha level. The beta level is you working as hard as you can on your own to get where you want to go. Does that make sense? But you know, in your heart of hearts, you're capable of more, as indeed do all your team members. So you're capable of operating what we call the alpha level. And between alpha and beta is what I term the performance gap. The opportunity to improve, to develop, to engage, to grow. And all of your individual team members know that gap is there. But in traditional management, it's not addressed. So what happens is, if you start applying a coaching methodology, what you're looking at is bringing a 5, 10, even a 15 or 20% improvement into the performance of the individuals you have working for you. Now you multiply that by the number of people you have working for you, and all of a sudden the metrics that you get measured on start to change drastically. So what happens is you bring them up another level. We'll call that level beta 1. So now they're operating at a different level. And believe me, when you go through this process, this now becomes the benchmark for their capability, not this. Now what happens, of course? Well, now that they're operating at a very different level, they believe they're capable of doing even more than that. It's the natural condition in life. So what happens is they now believe they can do it. So the performance gap never closes, but the bottom line is the baseline changes. Another way of describing that is to think about coaching as a journey of self-actualization. It's about helping people continuously improve. The Japanese use the expression kaizen, which is about small improvements consistently applied changes organizations. And the best way to describe it is if you look at typically the performance of an individual under traditional management, what you'll tend to get is you'll tend to get ups and you'll tend to get downs. So you get this kind of a boom and bust type situation. Are you familiar with that when you look at the people that you're employing? Do you see that on a regular basis? Yeah. So sometimes they're fantastic and sometimes they're not so fantastic. And this is typically where our management interventions kick in. We start telling them all the things they're doing wrong and what they should do better. But in coaching, it's different. In coaching, the process is that you set out a set of very specific goals, usually based around competencies. And what happens is they move until they get that set of goals. And then they rest, and then they reflect. And then you set another set of goals. And then they rest, and then they reflect. And then you set another set of goals. And the process continues. So really what coaching is designed to do is to create an environment in which we're helping our people self-actualize, become the very best that they can be in incremental steps. Now, is there a limit to this? Yes, there is. The role will dictate the limit. So by the time they get up here, maybe it's time for them to move on. But then that's what a good manager does. A good manager doesn't try to hold on to his or her people. A good manager grows his people so that they grow and ultimately become advocates for him or her within the wider organization. That's leadership. True leaders don't create followers, they create other leaders. But often what they need is they need a methodology by which to do that. Does that all make sense to everyone? Yep. By the way, if you have any questions as we go through it, feel free to ask, okay? So let's take a look at why a coaching culture should be in place. Traditional leadership is based on expertise. It's based on your authority. It's based on the fact that you have more experience, you should know what you do a lot better than the person that you're managing or that you're leading, and it's based on your position. That's where your position, that's why you are where you are, because of your expertise and because of your authority, and that's where your authority comes from. It comes from your position. And it's based on a command and control model that we have used for thousands of years. It's hierarchical. Command and control, in other words, is, beatings will continue until morale improves. That's pretty much the approach that was applied. But that's all changed, or changing. Because in today, we're moving to a very different model of leadership. We're moving to a model of leadership that is more, you might call this previous model masculine-based. So it tends to be strongly hierarchical, based on expertise, based on authority, based on the ability to command and control, and based on the fact that the people who work for you wanted to hold on to their jobs. In other words, there was no mobility in the workspace. But today, leadership is becoming more feminine-centered. And by feminine, what I mean is it uses networking, collaboration, inclusion, innovation, synergy. These are feminine traits. And what's allowing us to do that has been the revolution in communications. So today, very similar to what I said earlier about the fact that a manager's job is to help your individual team member on this journey of self-actualization and accomplishment, is the job of a leader in today's world is to create the environment in which our people can excel. So we now call this new model of leadership servant-based leadership. So we're no longer the masters, we are the servants, and it's how we empower our people, it's how we create the environment in which they can be successful, it's how we set up the structures that work, that will determine the success of your teams into the future, particularly sales teams. And one thing I do know about selling, it is the world's most accidental profession. I spent 30 years in sales. I did not, when I was 7 years old, say, I want to be a salesperson when I grow up. Anybody here say that when you were 7? I guarantee you did not. And even if you did, your parents turned around and said, No way. And yet, here we are. So we neither receive a training in sales, nor do we really receive a training in sales leadership, although, of course, Denise's concept around the MBA would be a huge value add for what you want to do. So we need to learn a different way of engaging our people. In effect, ladies and gentlemen, the way I define it is, there are two kinds of people. There are advisors, which are the people who work for you, who engage with clients to build quality relationships that drive revenue with external clients. And then there's leaders or managers. And our job is to do exactly the same thing. Build quality relationships with people so that they buy into what you want them to do. And that means your team members are your internal stakeholders. So you're still selling, you're just selling in a different direction. Does that make sense? Yep. So these are the two models we need to be aware of, and the modern model is very much this issue of feminine-based leadership, this inclusive leadership element, which will increasingly become the element. And that means that as leaders, the fundamental skill sets that we now need to have are the skill sets of being able to coach, to mentor, to collaborate, and to engage effectively. It's no longer about communication. It's about how we connect, how we involve, and how we engage our people to work with us to accomplish the objectives that we're setting out to do. And in fact, in the sales arena, it's the same thing as well. The reality is, in the modern world, people don't want to talk to salespeople anymore. They want to talk to experts. Unfortunately, most of your experts are woefully inadequate at communicating with your clients. But it's one of the things you need to be aware of. The dynamics of the sales world are changing. So, let's define coaching, shall we? Because one of the things I come across time and time again is there's very few good definitions of what coaching is all about. I actually started coaching in 1997, would you believe, right? After working with a gentleman called Dr. Dennis Waitley, an American behavioral psychologist. I cold called for a year to get my first coaching client in Dublin. A year, right? And even then, you couldn't invoice it as coaching. It had to be called a management development intervention. Because the perception around coaching in those days was coaching was remedial. Why do you need a coach? Is there a problem? Are you not taking the pills? Is everything okay? So it took a year to get people to start taking the process on board. And now, of course, we see coaching everywhere. But coaching fundamentally is about performance. So let me give you a definition and let me work with this. This is my definition of coaching, which has served me well. It's a collaborative partnership between a coach and a client, and a system which identifies perceived obstacles, generates solutions, sets objectives, and implements action based on personal accountability. Let me break that down for you because it's a long definition. Collaborative partnership means that what we're looking to do here is create a synergy between ourselves and the individual that we want to coach. It is not a manager-staff member relationship. It is not that power-based. It is a relationship that's based on parity of esteem. So really, in a good coaching relationship, what you're doing for your staff member is you're letting them know that really what you want to do is clearly understand their challenges, and then with the expertise and insights and perspective that you have from years of experience, help them to create a synergy that will be bigger than them just working on their own. I sometimes call that two minds working on one agenda. And the agenda we're focused on is the agenda of the individual. Now, this is different for a manager. Let me just explain something in relation to this. A manager and a coach/mentor have two different orientations in terms of what they're doing. If you look at a manager, your role is to take the corporate agenda, whatever the business goals are, and to drive them down into the team. So your job is to get the team to do what they got to do in order to make the corporate agenda accomplishable, deliver on it. And that's what you get rewarded on. But if you start to think like a coach or to act like a mentor, and there's a difference between the two, you'll have a very different perspective. Your perspective now is the individual's agenda. Your perspective now is, where is the individual? What's critical for him? What's critical for her? What's not happening for them that they want to happen? And most importantly, if you can do the job well, both be a manager and focus on the corporate agenda, and be a coach and focus on the individual's agenda, what you get is this massive overlap between the individual and the corporate agenda. And what does that mean? It means we get self-directed teams. It means we get people who don't require the same level of leadership or management that they required in the past. Because now what they're doing is they're delivering on the goals that you want them to deliver on because they see a personal value in doing so. More than just the money. Other reasons. And only they will know what those reasons are. But if you're good as a coach, you'll identify what those personal reasons are and you will align them with the corporate agenda, which means that you have less work to do as a manager. Because typically what happens as a manager is, and I'm sure you're familiar with the term, you're engaged in monkey management. Monkey management is where, as a manager, your tendency is someone comes to you with a problem, you say, I'll fix it. And you jump in straight away and you go fix the problem because you can. But as soon as you do that, you're no longer a manager. What you've done is you've taken the monkey off their back and now you're managing their monkey and they can go off and do what they want to do. And that leaves you with two kinds of people on your team. Those who come to you every time there's a problem because they know you'll take it over every time. And those who get frustrated because you don't allow them to grow inside your team. And they traditionally want to exit your team because they're not getting any value out of it. Coaching will help you prevent that. Because coaching will teach you how to hand stuff back and empower your people. So, that said, let's move forward. Now, it is a system. So we are looking, two minds working on one agenda, which is the agenda of the staff member that you're working for, but it's a methodology. It is a process. So in other words, there's very specific tools that are used to drive performance. The challenge that I see in a lot of cases where people are doing coaching is that it's a nice conversation. How are you? How's it going? How are things? That's not coaching. That delivers nothing except a nice conversation and a cup of coffee. There's no measurable outcomes. If there's no measurable outcomes, it's not a coaching engagement. There must be a methodology to the process. And I'm going to share with you some of that methodology a little later on. Now, here's the key. It's around helping the individual deal with perceived obstacles. Now, perceived obstacles are the challenges they see in the role that they're doing because they're in the job doing what they're doing. Does that make sense? So it's specific to their perception of where they're at and what they're doing. So, for example, let's say they have a challenge with a particular client. And that becomes a big problem because they are not in a position to see a way around that. But you can. You might have dealt with that in the past. So you want to be able to give them an understanding of how to deal with it so they become empowered in order to deal with it again and again and again in the future. I sometimes call this the Crossroads Syndrome. Anybody here ever done a crossword? Yeah? And you get stuck on a particular word, and no matter how hard you try, you cannot get that word. And you can't finish the crossword because of it. And then some other individual comes in and you say, they say, what's the clue? And they say, well, it's X. And straight away, they have no problem coming up with the word because they're not involved. They're not emotionally engaged in the crossword. But once they give you that insight, all of a sudden you can finish the crossword. That's what coaching is. It's not about doing the crossword for them. It's about giving them that insight, that piece of perspective that all of a sudden brings everything else together. And in that moment, that person has changed. They've moved up to beta 1. Because they can never go back to the way they were. Because they can never unlearn that insight. They can never unlearn that value. And that's where the power comes in coaching. So perceived obstacles are about helping them do the crossword. Then once you come up with a solution, you set a very specific objective and you build actions. And here's the key, personal accountability. Now, ordinarily, a manager can't be a proper full-time coach. Same reason a manager can't be a mentor. And the reason you can't be a mentor is that you are in the direct line of appraisal of the individual that you're mentoring. And because you're in the direct line of appraisal, because you're going to make a judgment about them at some point, they will not share with you their real challenges. Why would they do that? If they know that you're going to make a judgment about them at some point in the future. You have to. You're their manager. So in mentoring, we have what's called the knight's position. And the knight's position is typically you have a manager, you have the person who's the mentee, and a mentor typically sits here. 2 levels above and 1 level to the side. Not in the direct line of appraisal. That's a good mentoring relationship. That said, A manager can use coaching methodology to help the individual, but what they will not share with you is everything they may very well share with an external coach, or everything they may share with an external mentor, or a mentor who's not in the direct line of appraisal. So as a coach, you can use the methodology, but this last piece might be a bit more challenging, although it works, and the dynamic is very powerful. We talk about personal accountability. When I sit down and I talk to a potential client about working with me as their coach, I talk about personal accountability. And what that means is they're not accountable to me. They can fire me anytime they like. Okay? Now, this is where the difference is. Strictly speaking, as a manager, they are accountable to you. And that's where there's a bit of a sort of a gray area. But it's still a good metaphor. They're not accountable to me. But equally, they're not accountable to themselves. Because if we were always accountable to ourselves, well, we'd keep our New Year's resolutions. How many of you have done that so far? Okay? We don't. Because we fall back to what's easy, particularly when we're under stress. We get a default position. So here's what personal accountability means in coaching. It means that I, as your coach, will hold you personally accountable for your goals. That means that you meet with them on a regular basis, fortnightly or monthly, whenever the situation has to be, and you will go through their methodology in detail. And they know at a certain time, on a certain day, you're going to sit down and you're going to go through this. And by the way, this is not about judgment. This is not about telling them, as in the old traditional model of leadership, where they've done wrong and how to fix it. This is simply an assessment. It's a means of getting them to understand the lessons that they've learned. Because here's the thing. What's that old story about teach a man how to fish and he can feed himself for life? That's what we should be doing as modern leaders. Teaching them to learn the power to be the best at what they do. So that's what coaching is fundamentally about. And this issue of personal accountability, this idea that you will hold them personally accountable to themselves to deliver, is a powerful impetus to make change. I've had CEOs get up at 5 o'clock in the morning because they're meeting me at 7 and they haven't finished their to-do list. I don't make them do that. Well, maybe I'm a little intimidating from time to time, but they do it because they understand this is about them. This is for them. This is their stuff. And that's where change happens. No matter how good a manager you are, no matter how good a leader you are, you can never empower and motivate people more than they can do that for themselves. And that's what this model is about. Okay? So let me walk you through a model in terms of what coaching actually deals with, what it delivers on, how it functions, and how it does it successfully. And the 6C model, as I call it, is down to context, clarity, control, confidence, communication, and competence. So it's fundamentally all about performance at the end of the day. Let me break the first one down for you in terms of context. Context is your environment. What's going on for the client? What's going on in their world? What's happening for them? Are they reactive or are they proactive? Now, if I were to ask you guys, where are you presently on that scale? Are you more reactive than proactive in what you do? I'd say there's a pretty good chance most of us will be on the reactive scale because we have so much stuff to do. And that'll be the same for your teams. And that's why your sales teams are not accomplishing everything they're capable of accomplishing. Because they're reacting. They're firefighting. And they're firefighting because they've never had anybody sit down with them and make some enforced reflective time to start thinking actively about what's important to them and why it's important to them and how they're going to deliver it. So the whole purpose of coaching is to help your sales team move into a far more proactive mode than a reactive mode. I guarantee you, if I went into your team today, right now, and sat down with them, I guarantee you 90% of your people are reacting, they're not proacting. That's not your fault, by the way. That's just the way life is. So how do we help them move out of that space? Well, how we help them move out of that is we move to clarity. And clarity, effectively, is the ability to set effective goals. And goals have two key elements to them. They have a what, which is usually what the individual wants to do and delivers on the corporate agenda. In other words, what the team needs to deliver on. So that could be, for example, I want to increase my targets by 25% this quarter. I want to open a new vertical market for X, Y, Z. I want to be able to deliver a presentation to close that contract. I want to finish my tendering process so I can deliver for the business. It is something around the job that they have to do that delivers to the corporate agenda. And usually that's where coaches stop, with the what. But the reality is it's not enough. Because what you have to find is the why. And this is the personal agenda. Because once you've found out what they want to do, you now have to ask them, well, why specifically is that of value to you? What will you have that you don't have right now when you make that happen? Forget about the company, forget about the team. What will you have? And that's a powerful question. Because that's when you get to the heart of the matter. That's where you get to why they'll get up at 5 o'clock to get the job done. That's when they become self-empowered. That's when they become self-directed. That's the gold. That's when you link their personal agenda to the corporate agenda. And so this bit here is a really important bit to get. Now, once you've got the what and the why, the next stage then is to ensure that you break it down into individual actions. So in doing so, you give them control. So let me ask you a question. You now have a bunch of individuals on your team who know exactly what they want to do. They know exactly why it's critically important to them, and they know they have all the individual steps that they need to get there, and they control those steps. What happens to their confidence? It's not a trick question. It goes right up, doesn't it? All of a sudden, it's gone right up, because confidence is all about that. And by the way, you can't be confident unless you're competent. Competence precedes confidence. But if you know what you're doing and why, and you know exactly the steps you have to take, and you know you're in control of it, and every time you take an action, things change, your confidence grows. Now, what happens to a person who's confident in terms of their ability to communicate? You now get something that's critical to be powerful as an influencer. My job, by the way, is I help experts become influencers. So I take people really, really good at their job, but they're not good at the influencing bit. They're not good at building high levels of trust. They're not good at networking to build brand. They're not good at presenting at a conference stage or at an individual presentation. They're not good at using questions to control the minds of the people they're working with. But technically, they're very good. But communication is the reason the sale gets done. See, the original word for selling is selge, which means to be of service. We can't be of service to people unless we're powerful communicators. And that works on two levels. One, that they're telling you as their boss what they're doing. How many of you people on your team who work really hard, do really well, but don't tell anybody about it? And if you don't recognize them because you're too busy in the day-to-day management, you lose those people. But in a coaching methodology, you won't, because you'll go one-to-one with them. But more importantly, what communication and clarity and control gives people is congruence. Congruence means that you are powerfully convincing as a communicator. It means every part of you works to be successful as a communicator. When you're incongruent, your body language doesn't match your words. I'll give you an example of what I mean. You guys are probably one of the most exciting and dynamic bunches of people I've ever worked with. See the difference? What you're looking at is my body language, not the words. That's more convincing than what I say. But when you're a powerful communicator, if you have the confidence, the clarity, and the sense of control, everything flows as it should, and that's what closes more deals. People buy from confident people. Would you agree? Yes? And you know they don't buy when you're desperate, because I've been there. They don't, do they? So, we want our people confident and congruent and powerful communicators, because ultimately, that drives their competence, their performance. And actually, how this model works best is if you work it backwards. So you can see somebody's not performing. So the first question you ask yourself is, well, how good are they at communicating the message to our clients? Okay. How good are they at communicating what they're doing to me? Because maybe I'm overlooking what they're doing. So they're not good communicators. Okay, well, how confident are they about what we do? Not very confident. Okay, do they feel they have any sense of control over what they're doing? No. Well, do they know what they have to do and why it's important? No. So what's going on in their environment right now? and what do we need to change? You see the way the model works backwards? And with a proper coaching model, you'll address all of those issues. Okay? All right. So let's talk about the coaching meeting. Actually, let's just take a moment there, if we will, actually. Because what I'd like to do, if I may, because I really want to workshop this, so rather than just me transmitting, let's get some perspective around the table what some of the coaching challenges happen to be with everyone, now that we've looked at some of the theory behind it. So what I'd like you to do, please, is if you could just have a conversation with the people at your table about maybe what I've covered so far, and then specifically where you are with coaching, where you'd like to be with coaching with your team, and what you perceive as the primary challenges. Would that be okay if we took 5 minutes on that? Okay, let's just do that now, please, if you would. So introduce yourself to someone if you don't know them, and begin the conversation. Okay, just 5 minutes. Okay, guys. Kira, do you have a mic? So any questions, any comments, any feedback on those conversations we just had? Anybody like to make a comment or ask a question around what we've done so far? Don't be shy. This is your chance to shine. This gentleman here, Kira, would like to ask a question.
So, yeah, we were just talking some of the challenges about... Some of the challenges around coaching, and one that came up time again was the time and effort. Initially, it's very high and there's a lot of work required, but that decreases with time.
That would be true. I mean, typically, if you have a proper methodology, the most you should spend with somebody initially kicking the process off is about 3 hours maximum. And then after that, you're looking at an hour, a month, or half an hour every fortnight, face-to-face time. And it doesn't even have to be done live, it can be done by phone. So if they're on the road, it's ideal. The reason people spend a lot more time in it is they focus on the conversation as opposed to the methodology. So it's really critical in coaching that you have a systemic approach to measuring outcomes. And I'm going to share with you what that is now that you'll hopefully find useful along the way. But the other issue is, and I've said it to a couple of tables I was speaking to, is this. We get distracted ourselves. I mean, it's telling that only 3 or 4 people in the room of 50 people, 60 people, actually have a coach, as opposed to the rest of you who don't. And if you look at the reality of it, I mean, the issue of cost of a coach, I mean, you might spend less than $5,000 for 6 months coaching on a manager. But every change that happens to that manager in that process is multiplied by the number of people they have working for them. So that's, it's quickly earned back. And here's the thing. Once it's in place, it continues. And that's what you need to look at. So it's not enormously expensive stuff here, but it's very powerful because of the multiple effect that it has in relation to working with the rest of the team. But it doesn't need to take a lot of time. It can be down to 30 minutes, an hour maximum on a monthly basis if you have a methodology to do it. Yeah? Good. Thank you. Excellent question. Any other questions, comments? Wow. Clearly telepathy is required. Okay. Yes, that gentleman over there, Kira, please. Sorry, I'm a little
Sorry, just talking to Paul here, just about the monkey scenario.
Oh, yes, yes.
Paul said that what he tries to do is empower the people, which I thought was a good trait in itself. When they come, what would you do in the circumstance, and give it back to them.
Absolutely.
And kind of, they then kind of don't come back after a while. They're making their own decisions, and it's worked for him. He said that's worked very well for him, to kind of saying to them, well, what would you do? And then eventually kind of said, well, why are you asking me when you know how to do it yourself?
Well, it's true, and I completely agree with you in the fact that an awful lot of people, particularly managers, don't manage their boundaries. So they let their professional boundaries bleed. In other words, they let people through when they really shouldn't let them through, because it's not appropriate for them to be doing certain things. You need to be clear about what that is. So being able to push back by using effective questions is a very good way of doing it, because it forces them to think for themselves. But the other side of that is you need to be comfortable that they may not do it your way. All that matters is they do it and they get to where they need to go. So coaching actually provides a very clear methodology to make that happen. But it's a very good thing to be able to do on a day-to-day basis.
You mentioned at the start there just about the two different leaders, and the world is
Yes.
changing with the younger people.
Yes.
And anyone that has kind of teenagers, 18 up to 25-year-olds, understands that they're more vocal and more. How do you manage the younger people coming up in the sense that the boundaries where the boundary is
Yep.
as against,
Yep.
what they should say?
And that's a really interesting question, because probably for the first time ever, we have multi-generational teams. So we have people who come in and they're 18 or they're 20 or they're 22, and then we have guys who are in their 50s, right, and ladies who are in their 50s, who maybe have returned, or guys who have been there forever, and they all have equally powerful capability and value, absolutely every single one of them. And the other challenge that we have is that the hierarchical model is disappearing in organizations anyway, so organizations are becoming much more flatlined, becoming much more matrix managed. You cannot exercise command and control in those environments. And if you attempt to exercise command and control with millennials and people of that generation, they'll just tell you no. It won't happen. So coaching and knowing a methodology and that collaboration piece is something that they respond to very, very well indeed. And in fact, actually all generations do. And I would suggest, and I've seen it, where people who've been managed by a pure command and control style have never blossomed or developed or grown, when as soon as they got one-on-one with somebody, that all changed. A whole different ballgame started. So this multi-generational thing is something we need to look at. And this other issue of the fact that we're dealing with more matrix and flatlined, non-hierarchical organizations is changing that process as well. So that's an excellent point. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I'd say about command and control, my partner works in the public service, and I find that to be
Command and control.
different. Yeah.
But the problem with the public service, as you'll see, it does not empower their people to make individual decisions. If it did, things would get done quicker. Okay? But the reality is that they will have to change as the commercial world changes. But all these changes start with the commercial world. It's already happening in that space. And I talk about, I have a new book coming out this year called Invoking the Feminine. And Invoking the Feminine is not about necessarily women, although it is about empowering women. I'm a fairly typical alpha male. I'm an ex-merchant naval officer, ex-professional bodyguard. I've done all the male stuff. But I have strong feminine traits. So in other words, empathy, consideration, duty of care, networking, a desire to collaborate. They're all feminine traits, and they make me strong. But equally, women can be encouraged to utilize and maintain their femininity, but adopt and utilize masculine traits as it's appropriate. So, to be ambitious, to be command and control where required. So these are things that we need to be aware of. The whole society is starting to change, and we need to be a part of that. And as leaders, it's going to become really important for us to be able to embrace both of those issues. The issue of the future is not about a gender, it's about traits, it's about values. And that's how the world is shaping itself. Yep. We okay, guys? Yep. Any other questions before I carry on? No. Okay, thank you very much. All right, let's talk about the coaching meeting. So the first thing is that coaching is an intervention. Typically, it's not a long-term engagement. It's not something you're going to do for 12 months, 18 months, 2 years. That's a mentoring engagement carried on by somebody who's not the manager. Coaching is more of a style, it's more of an approach, but the methodology that you use is typically something that you would use at a maximum for about 12 months. 6 months, 3 to 6 months is the typical average. So if you think about it this way, you have your salesperson who's motoring along, he or she is doing fine, and then you give them a wee bit of acceleration. That's what coaching is designed to do. It's to give them an acceleration beyond a certain point, to take them to a whole other level, and then get to those objectives, prove to themselves that they can do it, empower their confidence, and let them off. And then you may want to return it again 6 months after that. But it's not something you necessarily have to do with everybody all the time. And actually, one thing I do want to mention about command and control and about models of leadership as well, it's important is, if you take this as performance and you take this as time, typically, this is skills and wills. So your ability to do the job and your willingness to do it, skills and wills. Over the course of a person's career, what you get is a bell curve. You get something like this. And why is that relevant? Well, at this level, the person has low skill levels, low competencies, but very high willingness. And then at this level, they're exiting the organization, or they're thinking of retiring, or they're looking to get out of it, or whatever. They have very high skill levels, but they have very low willingness or a lack of motivation to deliver. It's at those two key areas that you will still apply command and control. But in this area here, where you have people with high skill levels and high willingness to engage, to be a part of the process, that you apply your coaching intervention, okay? Which is pretty much nearly everybody on your team. So it's an intervention. It doesn't go on forever. It's used in short bursts to accelerate performance. It's usually handled weekly or fortnightly. So weekly, it can be half an hour, or fortnightly, or even monthly. But you're not spending more than sort of 60 minutes in any one session. And by the way, you don't actually have any preparation to do. Because the beauty about coaching is they do all the work. You just show up. You have no preparation to do, nothing to do. The ownership of the methodology, the ownership of the process belongs to the individual team member. And they do all the paperwork. And they own all the paperwork. And they do all the deliverables. And your job is to be there at the right time, on the right day, to review. And initially, to prep it all, to set it up, to make it all happen. Most importantly, that you need to do the coaching in private, and you need to do it in a neutral venue. So in other words, don't do it in your office. Get a third-party location, maybe a meeting room, or go out and have a coffee, wherever it happens to be. Just make sure that they have a table where they can sit and where they can write. Okay? It's very important because if you have a situation, well, let me put a premise here. You're being called to the manager's office. What does that resonate of, right? Oh, I'm in trouble, right? And then they enter the manager's office and the door closes behind them, right? So it does nothing for their state of mind, and it does nothing for their brand as far as the rest of the team is concerned if they're being called into the office. So what you don't want is, remember I said earlier that it's not a power issue. It's not, I'm your manager, you do what I tell you to do. We're looking for parity of esteem. We're looking, insofar as possible, to have a mutual engagement. And that's why the third-party venue makes it easier for them to open up and to engage. The management is where you do the office is where you do the command and control stuff, the feedback stuff. The coaching, you do it in a third-party venue, neutral venue. Does that make sense? Yep. And here's the thing. They do the writing. So in all of the systems that you use, they do the writing. And the reason they do the writing is twofold. One, they believe and do have ownership of the process. And second of all, when they're writing, they're driving three key modalities. When they write, they're speaking to themselves what it is, so they're hearing it. They're feeling it, so there's a kinesthetic element, and then there's a visual element. So these are three key learning modalities, and the means by which repetition happens. And if you want to change behaviors, repetition is what changes behaviors. I talk about repetition is internalization. The more often you do something, the more it becomes the way you do things from that point forward. So it's very important that they write physically with a pen and paper what they do and how they make it happen. And then ask them for a copy of the notes. Okay? And that way they're sharing with you what they've accomplished to do. It's not seen as a management demand, it's seen as a coaching request. So let's talk about some tools then. What do we do? What's the methodology? How does it work successfully? The first thing is what's called the competency wheel. So in a lot of coaching tends to be either one of two forms. It tends to be competency-based, so it's based on a set of skills, or it's what we call blue sky coaching. Blue sky coaching is where the individual sets the agenda, whatever the objectives happen to be. That's usually something that's used by an external coach with maybe yourselves, for example, or a senior member of the organization. But competency coaching is typically what's used within a team, where you're agreeing a set of competencies that they are going to work on to develop in order to improve their general performance. I'll talk about that in a second. The next thing you're going to use is you're going to use very effective questioning skills. Now, we haven't got time to go into all that here this morning, but there is a whole series of question skills that can be used to manage and influence how a person thinks and how they respond. I'll share some of those with you this morning. SMART goals, many of you will be familiar with, but maybe not familiar with the effective form of how they should be articulated or how they should be developed. So I'll mention something briefly about that as well. And lastly, an action plan. So the action plan is what they take out of the room, and it's what gets reviewed every fortnight or every month, depending on how you tend to work with people. Okay? So let's talk about competency wheel. What is a competency? A competency is what we call an advanced skill set. Now, an advanced skill set is something that can be measured. So typically, competencies will be things like networking skills, presentation skills, report writing, administration. It is not something like honesty or loyalty or truthfulness. You understand? They're values. And while they're very admirable values, you can't measure them. And even if you did, people will still claim they get 100% on them anyway. I'm 100% truthful, even when I'm lying. Okay? So you need to be aware you can't measure that, but you can measure a competence. Now, I'm going to give you an exercise now, and that exercise is this. You all manage sales professionals. What should be the competencies that should be managed in that process? So I'd like you to have a conversation at your table in terms of, if I'm going to measure competency or advanced skill sets, what are the ideal skill sets that my team members or a fairly traditional salesperson should have to be really successful at what they do? What do you think those things should be? Off you go. Have a conversation about that and let's see what you come up with. I'm looking for at least 6. So we got some sense of what those competencies might be, and would anybody like to share what you think they should be as far as your team's performance is concerned, and we'll see if we can capture them here on the board. Anybody like to make a comment? This gentleman here. So what was coming up for you guys?
Well, I've got more of a question actually than a competency. So we were struggling with. I was making the point that I've had teams where you've got salespeople and account managers.
Yes.
And there was a kind of a very nebulous skill that salespeople had to close deals that account managers didn't have. They still had the same influencing skills, networking skills, communication skills, etc. But we couldn't really put our finger on what was that skill that the salesperson has. We kind of know it and we see it, but we couldn't define it over other people in the organization. And that's kind of one of the things that we were trying to see. How do you define that?
If you look at deal closing, for example, would be a competency. Okay? So the deal closing piece might break down to how many people, I mean, if you take that just as a simple competency, you could ask a salesperson to measure how they're doing on deal closing, right? So if they think they're doing really well, they might give themselves a high score. If they don't think they're doing so well, they might say, give them a low score. Now, if you're getting a high score, you can correlate that against their numbers and say whether they're telling you the truth or not. But if you get a low score, the question's very simple. What's not happening for you in deal closing that you want to happen? So you could break deal closing down into a number of areas. It could be how good is the level of rapport you're building with people? Are you getting access to the right decision makers? What are the questions you're using? What are you not asking? What are you afraid of? Are you feeling confident? How good is your quality of your presentations? So you see, deal closing opens out into all kinds of areas. And you could have 5 salespeople, and each one of them is a different challenge with deal closing. But it's still a competency. And it's a competency because you can measure. They can say, well, I want to close 20% more deals this month or the next 6 months. Typically, when you set a goal, it's not going to be less than 3 to 6 months. Absolute minimum 3 months. And then what you can do is when you define that, you can break it down. Okay, what do we need to do that we're not doing right now? And that's where we get the actions. So you can just use deal closing as a competency because we can measure it, because we can break it into a specific objective. Does that make sense? So that's a good one. We can use that one as a start. Deal closing. Okay? Any other ones? Sorry, sir? Pipeline development. Absolutely. What are we doing around pipeline development? So where's our numbers? How qualified are they? What's their chances of closure? What are we doing that we need to do in order to increase that? Okay? Are we getting to the right decision makers inside that? How are we defining the people we want to put into our pipeline? There's different things we could look at. Anything else? Yes, sir. Effective sales process. Okay, so when you say effective sales process, is that they're doing the process, as in they're doing the paperwork, they're doing the administration? Okay. Well, let's break that down, because the sales process itself is made up of a series of competencies, if you will. So there's cold calling or prospecting. There's networking. So a sales process is a pretty nebulous thing. You need to break it into specific bits that need to happen. Does that make sense? So what about the meeting? Getting the meeting? Yes?
That they're following some kind of a process, or I believe they should be
Okay.
following some kind of a process.
So then what I would call that is meeting process or meeting management. Would that be a reasonable definition of that? How we're managing the meeting or the outcomes?
Yeah, I suppose it's effectively taking a customer through each stage of your process so that they understand basically as they go along.
Within the one meeting, though?
Within
yes?
the one meeting, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm just looking for the right word in terms of defining it in a way that they would use it. Have you got a comment? Sorry? Negotiation. It's more than negotiation, though, is it? Say again? The customer journey. Okay, customer journey. I can work with that. Or the meeting journey.
Yep.
We could work with that. How competent are they? What are they comfortable with? I'll just take that one as well that you just mentioned, which is negotiation, because that's definitely a skill set. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask on the deal closing, like.
So they just need to hear
You
what you're saying.
mentioned the difference. You were wondering what's the difference, and you mentioned how, you have to see on multiple things, like.
Yes.
But one thing you didn't mention that I think it's probably the answer for it is have the goal, as I said, what you want to achieve with that. Do you make the sale? Are you asking for the sale? Because that's the difference.
So this is in relation to the deal closing piece? Yeah. Okay. Well, I think the deal closing can be a goal, because what happens is it's different for everybody in terms of how they approach it. And the challenges will be different as well. Okay, so thank you very much. We got some good ideas: deal closing, pipeline development, customer meeting journey, negotiations, and we could throw in networking, we could throw in presentation skills, we could throw in, travel planning. How effective are you at that? How good are you maintaining your process and administration, for example? So there's a whole series of things. So what you're looking for is about 6 to 10 of these competencies that we're now going to use as a self-benchmarking process. Now, I don't have a copy of the documents here, but let me explain and some of you may have come across this before. It's a very simple document. It's composed of a wheel, and you'll get sort of lines across the wheel, and you'll have a series of competencies around that wheel. And the way the process works, being a self-evaluating process, is typically you'll put your competency here, which is networking, meeting planning, whatever. And you'll ask them to measure themselves out of 10, where 10 is the best they can be and 0 is the worst. And typically what happens is 0 to 3 is poor to average, 4 to 6, average to good, and then 7 to 10 is good to excellent. Now basically 0 is the center of the circle, and the circumference is 10. So they'll go along and they'll put a dot on where they typically are at all their different competencies. And usually working with sales guys, I probably wouldn't do more than 6 as a maximum. That's more than sufficient to cover pretty much everything. So you'll ask them to put a dot on the line, and then you'll ask them to simply connect the line, from here. And what this is it's a buy-in tool. It's a visual representation. It's an exercise that they conduct. And then you simply ask them, okay, out of those areas, what 2 or 3 areas would you like to work on for the next 6 months? So after they've self-assessed, basically you just simply say, well, what of these 6 areas do you want to work on? It may not necessarily be the area that they score least on. because it may not always be relevant at that point in time. Does that make sense? They may very well choose an area that they're pretty good at, but they want to be the best at. So you give them the choice of choosing what areas you're going to look at in terms of setting objectives. And obviously, the more we do that, the more buy-in we have to delivering on those objectives. And that's the essence of coaching, bringing them into the process. So I'm not driving them anymore. I'm not telling them anymore. I'm not instructing them anymore. They're working with me now in a partnership of performance. And the other piece is a visual representation. So here's the thing. Once you've done this exercise and you've identified the 3 areas you want to work on, you do it again in 6 months' time. And what happens in 6 months' time is the wheel should have changed. And it will definitely change. So they'll clearly see if they feel that they've improved or they've developed or they've accomplished what they want to set out to do. So it's an excellent benchmarking tool. Once we have identified the objectives we want to work on, we now bring our SMART goal out. Now, many of you will be familiar with SMART goals. So there's 4 elements. There's the goal itself. There is the actions that need to happen. It's a convincer, and it's a deadline. But the key thing is identifying the what and the why. I've spoken about this already. The what effectively deals with the conscious mind. And the conscious mind is what we're thinking about right now. So how long is this guy going to go on talking for? When are we going to have a coffee? It's the stuff that's going through your brain right now. But here's the thing. What makes change is the subconscious mind. The subconscious is the part that you're not aware of, but that drives your processes like your breathing, your heart rate, all that powerful stuff that allows you to function as a person. And what happens is the conscious mind has a very limited capacity. It can only process 7 plus or minus 2 things. That's it. And we spent years training it. But we actually receive at least 2 million bits of information per second. And so the way we function is what the brain does is it deletes it, distorts it, and generalizes information to allow us to function. So you know when you get overwhelmed, and that happens all the time, it's because this number has been breached. The rest of the stuff goes in here. And your world will be an exact manifestation of what you focus on. Energy follows intention. So if we want our people more energized and more effective, what's really important is that we're in a position to focus them more effectively than the past. And to do that successfully, we need to understand what they want to do, and then we need to understand the why. That's important to them. When I'm training business development people, I tell them there's 2 fundamental elements you need to be aware of in modern business. The first is based on research done at Microsoft, that our attention span is now 8.5 seconds or less. The second thing is that all of your USPs no longer work. All those wonderful marketing messages you have are redundant. I'm sure the first thing you'll tell me is that unique selling points that you have are exactly the same as the unique selling points that your competitors use. And the problem is that you're selling to the head. You're not selling to the heart. 90% of our business decisions are emotionally driven. Cranfield University. Emotionally driven. And yet every message that I would imagine every organization in this room has are perfectly logical, but not compelling. And if you want to get 8.5 seconds of my attention, you better become a whole lot more compelling. It's the same with this. If you want to compel people to engage, you've got to find out the reason why it matters to them. And then you link that to what you need to do as a professional in your field. And that's the secret to successful coaching. The more you get them to buy in, the more likely you are to make it happen. And there's a whole set of rules around how that happens. Then you're going to ask the question. So the first question is in relation to deal closing. What specifically would you like to be able to do around deal closing? Or what's not happening for you that you'd like to happen? And that's how you identify what it is they do. Once they get the what down, the next question is, well, may I ask, why specifically is that important to you? What will you have that you don't have right now when you're that much better at closing deals? Personally. Now, if they turn around and say, well, I'll make more money, that's not an answer. The real answer is, what will that money allow you to do? And then I say, well, I got a nicer car, or take my kids to Disneyland. That's the motivation behind the goal. And that's where the skill sets comes in when you want to do good coaching. Okay? So once you can get the buy-in, which is what they want to do and why, that's what you put on paper. And the way you write it down is as follows. You get them to start every goal by writing, I want to improve my close ratio by 20% so that I can afford to take my kids to Disneyland. Can you see how that would be powerful? By the way, the goals need to be in the present tense. So I want to, it's personal present tense, highly specific and fundamentally motivated. The unconscious mind doesn't understand the future tense. So if you've been setting goals in the past and you start off by saying, I will do something, you've already failed. It's not going to work. You're only engaging the conscious, not the unconscious. Let me explain what I mean. I said earlier that the unconscious understands and values the power of looking after all of your autoimmune systems, your heart rate, your breathing, basically your life support systems. Imagine if it understood a future tense. And it turns around and said, I'm feeling a bit knackered today. I'll have a heartbeat tomorrow. Not very effective. Got me? So you need to put it to be powerfully effective in the present tense. And the more specific it is, the more powerful it is as well. And that's what we want to do. Now, you then need to work with them on breaking it down. So typically what you do is, if you put this on a SMART goal, you turn it over the page, and you have them write down all the things they think they can do to make that goal happen. So you let them lead by writing down all the things they think they can do to make it happen. What's this about? Ownership, engagement, involvement. And then this is where you as a coach start to come in, because this is where your experience, your synergy, your innovation, your creativity comes in. You can then make suggestions about things that they have to do. Have you considered phoning Michael? Have you talked to Jimmy about reorganizing that present? I hadn't thought about that. Stick that down as an action. So what are you doing? You're facilitating their success. And then you get a whole series. The more actions you get, the more effective you're going to be. So lots of little actions are better than a small number of big actions. And here's why. An action, by the way, is something you can do when you can leave the room. Classically, we see things like take a training course. Take a training course is not an action. Take a training course is a sub-goal. What do you have to do to take a training course? Identify the course, agree the dates, get permission, make the call, get sign-off from finance, attend. Do you understand? They're actions. The other, you will fail. But with the latter, you will succeed. Because now, you have clarity and control. And lastly, you have a convincer, or second last, you have a convincer. How will they know that they're closing 20% more deals? Hell, I am having tequila in Disneyland. Well, that's assuming they serve tequila in Disneyland, I don't know. Maybe it's only soda, okay? But they have a clear image of how they are in terms of their success. The drums, fantastic. And lastly, you give them a deadline. And the deadline is a very specific date. You must have the day, the month, and the year. And usually your goals will run in 3 to 6 months or 6 to 12 months. Very seldom will any professional goals go beyond 12 months. That's your time frame. Oops. And lastly, the last tool that you will use is an action plan. And the way the action plan works is that you will identify 2 to 3 goals, and you will go through the previous exercise with each one of those goals. And then what you do is you take one action plan, and the goals feed in to that action plan. So when you've completed the facilitation part of the coaching, they just have one piece of paper. Just one. And that's the bit that gets reviewed when they come back the next day. And then that's what you reset for the day after that. Or, sorry, whatever the next meeting is going to be after that. This is getting exciting. goosebumps. So you'll always use it with a number of goals. So you'll have 2 or 3 goals. Sometimes the mistake I see is that people set up an action plan for each goal. That's not how you do it. 1 goal, and typically you'll ask them to take at least 1 action from each goal or 2 actions from each goal. So they're working simultaneously on all the goals that they've set for themselves. Constant improvement, Kaizen, small steps, big accomplishments. I beg your pardon? I'm sorry, I can't hear. Oh, right, okay. So let's say you have your 3 goals. So one is, I want to improve my deal closing skills by 20%. I want to attend at least 7 networking options. I want to take a training course to develop my blah, blah, blah. And each one of them may be 5 or 10 different actions. You would ask them, because it's important that they choose the actions, to choose 1 or 2 actions from each one of these goals and commit that to the action plan. So the action plan is formulated from the individual goals that you've agreed, which you always do in advance. And it's important that they choose the actions because they're making the commitments to what they will do. And always ask them to start with the small ones first. So the ones they can get done first. Because what happens? As soon as they start accomplishing and doing them and they see change, up goes the confidence. And they know this stuff works. And here's the thing. When I started coaching many years ago, I used to ask my clients, don't tell anyone that you're seeing a coach. And see if they noticed. And by session number 3, every time, without fail, when they came to their next session, somebody remarked on me. They said, God, you seem more confident. Are you on drugs? What's the story? And the reason is that because they felt more in control, that they understood, that they were in charge, that their whole body language changes. How you're feeling internally directly affects your physical posture. And it's a powerful tool for communication. Classic example. Monday morning, 9 o'clock. Hope the place is burnt down over the weekend. Back to work. And then on Friday at 5 o'clock, it's woohoo, my time. And everybody's standing up, feeling good. Your posture is reflective of your state. As soon as your guys start getting this and working it and making it happen and deliver, watch them change. And watch how the clients change around them. Communication, congruence, confident. Start with the easiest. Set a deadline. So basically, when you do your action plan, there'll always be a deadline for when we're going to meet next. So you get them to fill in. So when are we going to meet? Nobody ever leaves a session with you until you've agreed the next date. Always agreed in that session. Then follow up. And then what they do is, once they've agreed a date, you go back and you have them set a date against each of the actions that they've agreed. I found this early on in my coaching career that if I set a deadline and I had 5 or 6 actions, I might come back with 2 or 3 done. But as soon as I got them to micro-deadline each of the actions for when they would have it done before that date, all of a sudden, they're coming back with 4 and 5 and 6 done. And then your follow-up is critical as well. So make sure you don't leave that place without agreement about our next session. And that's the key. So hopefully in this session, what I've shown you now is a better understanding of coaching, its application within modern leadership, the fact that you can develop that style, and once you learn the methodology, you can get the kind of results that will improve your teams by 15 to 20% in terms of their capability and clarity. I've seen it myself. People I work with get that kind of change. Now, before I finish, if you want to get a copy of the action plan, the goal sheet, and the other stuff, leave your card with me up here. And we also provide a certain number of individual coaching sessions, complimentary sessions, every month. If you'd like to be considered for one of those, if you're leaving your card, just tick the card with ticks so we know we need to reach out to you about that session. Everybody okay with that? So hopefully you've enjoyed the session. You've learned something about coaching and how it's applied, and I'm happy to take any questions, if any. Otherwise, good luck and good hunting. Thank you very much.